Welcome to another hybrid talk held in front of both a live audience here in the Library Annex and a live Zoom audience. We're pleased to welcome today Oliver Price, whose topic is Militant Tendency and the Surveillance of Trotskyists in Cold War Britain. This talk is, as usual, free, but we welcome donations via the donate button on our website. Okay, I am going to share the screen and then hand over to Oliver. Over to you.
I'll just start off by just giving you a background on myself. So I'm a PhD student at the University of Wolverhampton, and primarily my research is on the surveillance of political and protest groups in the 20th century in Britain. And in that research, quite a lot of the groups that I look at tend to be communist, and the Trotskyist movement tends not to be seen as a particular threat. But when Militant Tendency came about in the 70s, the threat of Trotskyists were believed by the security services to be significant, such to the extent that, as I'm going to show you today, the surveillance was really stepped up and it was considered to be as great a threat as communists, if not a greater threat. So just to start off by giving you a background, so the first Trotskyist movement, first Trotskyist groups in Britain were founded in the early 1930s. And during the early 1930s, the groups were too disparate, that were very small, to be considered a real threat. I think the first period of time in which Trotskyists were considered to be of any relevance was in 1937, when the Revolutionary Socialist League and the Workers' International League were formed. But again, there wasn't much surveillance of those groups at all. They weren't considered to be a threat. And quite interestingly, during the 1930s at least, the Trotskyist movement, the surveillance of the Trotskyist movement was not from the state, but it was actually from the Communist Party. And there's quite a lot of interesting information on that. There's an article that's been written in the past by Neil Redfern in Contemporary British History, which really goes into depth about that. And it shows that the surveillance was very extensive at the time. The Communist Party actually had informants within the Trotskyist movement and things like that. They held files on Trotskyists. So the surveillance at that time was, from the state at least, was negligible. And there were a few files held, we believe, that current files suggest that. But at the beginning of the war, 1939, 1940, the security service actually moved its headquarters to Wormwood Scrubs prison. And in 1940, that was bombed during the Blitz. So all the files that were held, there weren't many, were actually burned. So by 1940, it kind of summed up the way the Trotskyist movement was perceived by the security services, by the state. There was no information held on it at all. You can actually find in some of the files that do exist today, there are things that have been left in where they say that these files were burned, or there are some photocopied files with sort of burned edges and things like that. But basically, by the beginning of World War II, the Trotskyist movement was in its infancy, and it was not important at all. The files that were held were reconstituted. Special Branch had some information, but largely it was considered not to be any threat at all. And it's kind of summed up by the fact they didn't hold any information. And surprisingly, you'd expect that during the war, Trotskyism that wasn't important would be of even less importance. But interestingly, we see in 1941, the Workers' International League actually started to get involved with strikes. So that brought it to the interest and the attention of the intelligence community. So they began to undertake slight degrees of surveillance, not too much, but still it was beginning to become of more importance. And the strikes that the WIL was involved with included a Rolls-Royce factory strike in Glasgow, munitions factories, bus strikes, and a Home Office warrant, which was a telephone tap or post interception, was taken out on the WIL offices. And they began to get a little bit of information on the WIL just to make sure that they knew what it was up to, sort of thing. But it wasn't considered a particular threat. But interestingly, they tried to get an informant within the movement. The security service was unsuccessful. Their files suggest that the person they did get provided no information that was of use, but they encouraged municipal police forces to do a similar sort of thing. And we can see from the files that that was actually considered to be quite significant information that they provided. So they were able to cover at the time. They didn't consider the threat to be massive, but they covered it instead, just to make sure they had knowledge of everything that had gone on. And then we see the threat, perception of the threat of Trotskyism start to change in 1944, when the WIL and the RSL merged to form the Revolutionary Communist Party. And there's quite an interesting file in the archives, which was written by Herbert Morrison, Home Secretary at the time. And he actually wrote a memorandum for Cabinet to make sure that he considered Trotskyism was significant enough of a threat to be it made known to the Cabinet exactly what they're on about. And because the Revolutionary Communist Party had been formed, Morrison suggested that this was a bit significant because it was the first time that the Trotskyist movement had begun to be discussed from outside the small rooms. They only had tens in the different groups in the past. And now it had a degree of more prominence. But it was quite difficult for the authorities to investigate because it was very, very secretive. They wouldn't use in files, they wouldn't use names, they'd use initials. Any conversations on the telephone and via the post, letters, they were all kept very secretive, very basic information, so nothing could be got from that. The Special Branch actually tried to recruit an agent again within the movement, and quite interestingly, they were unsuccessful, but for different reasons previously. It turned out that Special Branch had recruited the agent, but the agent had then gone to the Revolutionary Communist Party's own leadership, told them, and they said, accept it, but then turned the information back on Special Branch. And Special Branch found out about this, so they put an end to that. But we had a potential for a double agent working against Special Branch. And then through the information that they were collecting on the Revolutionary Communist Party, they found out that members of the RCP who were stationed abroad during the war, they had been utilised by the RCP leadership to try and recruit Trotskyists in liberated Europe, particularly Italy. You can see on the slide there was one in particular, Charlie Van Gelderen, who was stationed in Italy and was actually very successful. He helped to engage with Trotskyists in Italy, and he's been credited in obituaries with helping to form the first Trotskyist movement in Italy. And as you might see on the file, if you can see, I'm not sure if you can, but the letter was actually sent there informing the security service on the activities of Van Gelderen. And it was actually sent from Roger Hollis, who eventually became the Director General of the Security Service, and he sent the information on to a HAR Philby, so Kim Philby. So that's a little bit of information for you. And by the end of the war, the Trotskyist movement, although they'd investigated it extensively, it again took a back seat. They didn't consider it much of a threat. By the end of the 1940s, the RCP had broken up. And we actually read in files that the Trotskyist movement wasn't considered enough of a threat to be included in 1948. Clement Attlee's government introduced vetting procedures to make sure communists weren't working within the civil service. Trotskyists, they actually write, Trotskyists and fascists are not of enough importance to be included on the vetting. In the 1950s, there is virtually no investigations into the Trotskyist movement. One scholar has said that the 50s were the bleak years of Trotskyism. So the threat had basically gone away entirely during the 1950s. And then, as we see here, 1960s, early 60s, Trotskyists had begun to be involved on a minor level in protest movements, particularly the anti-nuclear protest movement. And their impact was not considered to be too great, but it was noted that they were involved. But as the decade went along, we see continually files suggest that Trotskyists were not a threat. But by 1968, there was a consideration that their threat was becoming more increased as Trotskyists had been highly influential in the Vietnam Solidarity campaign. And the picture there shows Tariq Ali, who was highly involved with protests in 1968 at Grosvenor Square to protest against the Vietnam War. And it was so significant at the time that the Special Branch actually formed a new unit to investigate, as the protests had taken them completely by surprise. They formed the SDS, the Special Demonstration Squad, who have also been referred to as the Hairies, because they infiltrated these groups and lived amongst them. So they grow their hair, grow beards, things like this. And it's quite topical at the moment, actually. There is a public inquiry into their activities that's set up about 5 years ago, and there've been a number of delays, but they're beginning to take evidence, and Tariq Ali actually gave evidence to the inquiry within the last year. So his group, the International Marxist Group, who played a big part in the Vietnam Solidarity campaign, they were infiltrated by one of the Hairies, and they provided the keys to the IMG's offices to the security service, who managed to get into their offices and take down a number of files, get some information, and sort of it moved on like that. But interestingly, by 1970, I presume it's the work of the SDS and the fact that the protests had dissipated, you can look at the files and see that the threat again is seen as negligible. The threat is it's virtually non-existent. But an interesting departure from that was in 1970, was in the Labour Party. And in 1973, the NEC, the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party, which had moved towards the left, decided to abolish the party's list of proscribed organisations, which is considered as a pivotal moment in allowing Trotskyists to enter the Labour Party. By 1975, the Labour Party's national agent, Reg Underhill, produced a report warning the party's leadership that Trotskyists were beginning to infiltrate the Labour Party. But because the NEC was then towards the left, it wasn't considered by the NEC members to be enough of a threat to warrant any investigation or any action to be taken. It's summed up quite well, actually, by Eric Heffer, who was a member of the NEC at the time. He said, Trotskyists had been inside the Labour Party for 30 years, and this was the kind of attitude that there was no need to take any action. But the Labour leadership changed in 1976. Harold Wilson retired as Prime Minister. He was replaced by James Callaghan. And Callaghan appointed Merlin Rees, who we can see down there at the bottom, as Home Secretary. And Rees, in his first meeting with the Security Services Director General, Michael Hanley, actually raised the infiltration of the Labour Party and asked the Security Service what could be done to help. And the Security Service was very aware. They'd written a number of reports. As early as 1971, they had suggested that this threat could potentially be significant if the Labour Party had weakened. And they write in a report in 1976 that the abolition of the prescribed list was pivotal. So in 1976, you might be able to see it up there at the top of the slide, you might not. I'll just read it out for you, actually. And they wrote that Trotskyist entryism in CLPs, constituency Labour parties, presents a direct threat to some MPs and thus to the parliamentary Labour Party's ability to resist subversive pressures upon and within the party as a whole. Because of its covert nature, the effect of entryism is difficult to assess. In 9 constituency Labour parties where there is Trotskyist influence, the sitting Labour MP is at risk. There are varying degrees of Trotskyist influence in a further 43 constituency parties, in constituencies with Labour MPs. In constituencies that are not represented by Labour MPs, Trotskyists have some influence in 24 constituencies. So the threat was, by 1976, the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister were concerned, the Security Service was concerned, but quite interestingly, mentioning Christopher Andrews' authorised history of the Security Service, they still weren't sure how much the Labour Party as a whole believed the threat to be considerable enough to warrant action. So the government thought it was, but potentially the Labour Party still didn't. And action really wasn't taken until the 1980s. So the major Trotskyist entryist organisation within the Labour Party at the time was Militant Tendency. And Militant was founded in the early 1950s as the Revolutionary Socialist League, not the same as a Revolutionary Socialist League in the 1930s, and became known as Militant from the mid-60s onwards when it launched its Militant newspaper. And Militant was very keen to practice entryism, which was defined as entering a socialist democratic party and transforming it from within. And Trotsky had advocated that himself in the 1930s. As early as 1959, the founder of Militant, Ted Grant, spoke of how the historical justification of the party for the policy of entryism was to transform the Labour Party so that eventually it would become a revolutionary party. And by the early 1970s, Militant members had gained control of the Labour Party's youth organisation, the Labour Party Young Socialists, and that enabled it to get a seat on the NEC. And then obviously by 1973, that helped with the abolition of the prescribed list. In 1975, Militant talked of consciously aiming to penetrate every constituency party in the country. By 1976, Militant appointed a full-time organiser to coordinate the penetration of all constituency Labour parties. And for the Security Service, Militant was a really difficult organisation to investigate because, again, like before in the 1940s, it was a very secretive organisation. There's a number of stories that are quite interesting that documents would be handed out at meetings, but would be collected in, they'd be numbered. We also can read from Michael Crick's report, and he's written a book on Militant before, and he said that On one occasion, cleaners were not even permitted to replace towels in the lavatories. Conference hall bar staff were not allowed to watch proceedings. And in 1980, a reporter had gained entry to one of Militant's meetings, but was discovered hiding in the toilets. So he was then thrown out. Interestingly, in 2002, Peter Taylor produced a documentary with the BBC where he interviewed a number of special branch officers. And one, Tony Robinson, actually admitted that they had managed to infiltrate militant meetings, and they'd arrived early and they'd hidden in what he described as a cubby hole in the back of the meeting, and they managed to record proceedings. And we can actually see in Christopher Andrews' authorised history of the security service, there are a number of mentions of things that had been recorded. Peter Taft, who was Militant's deputy leader, he was heard talking about how Militant would be the spinal column of the future mass revolutionary organisation and an indispensable weapon of the revolution in Britain. And despite the difficulties they found with investigating Militant, by the late 1970s, the security service believed it had around 75% of the membership they'd noted down, and they'd managed to use telephone checks and going to the conferences to make sure they knew what they needed to know. They also possibly used a number of informers. There's been some discussion of that in some of the literature, but there's not much on that. But despite that, they still weren't sure they knew everything, and they actually wrote at one stage that there are a number of limitations in the intelligence available on Militant as it was a clandestine organisation. And the key to Militant really is that although Trotskyist groups have been investigated in the past, they weren't considered to be a particular threat. Militant was very, very different. As I've quoted there, one of the Cabinet Office files have a quote from Sir Brian Cubban, who was the Permanent Secretary at the Home Office, and he wrote in 1984 that Militant appears to have replaced the Communist Party as the established focus for subversion in this country. And that's quite incredible, considering that the Communist Party was always the major threat, whilst Trotskyists couldn't really even unify themselves. So that the fact that 1984, there's such a comment from such a senior civil servant as that, it really shows the changes that had happened. And the reason behind this was the fact that Militant had been very successful. It was the first Trotskyist group, we can say for certain, that was considered a potential subversive threat. And the security service defined subversion as activities threatening the safety or well-being of the state and intended to undermine or overthrow parliamentary democracy by political, industrial, or violent means. And Militant was able to be seen as this because, unlike other Trotskyist movements, it was very unified and it had managed to infiltrate the Labour Party. So the combined two of that really helped it. The influence it had within the Labour Party enabled it to, as the picture there, gain influence on Liverpool City Council, which was a Labour-run council. In 1983, Labour gained a majority on the council, having 51 councillors, and only 16 of the 51 were actually Militant members, but they managed to work with the others to sort of achieve a Militant agenda. And Derek Hatton up there was the deputy leader at Liverpool City Council. He was really crucial in pushing the Militant line, and he was sort of the public face of Militant. Again, we can't be quite sure how much he was investigated, but again, in Peter Taylor's documentary, one special branch officer did admit that a file was held on him, unsurprisingly, I'd say. And then in the mid-80s as well, militant members, two militant members, Dave Nellis and Terry Fields, were elected as Labour MPs. Nellis is quite well, they're both interesting characters, but Nellis entered Parliament at the same election as Tony Blair, and they actually shared an office for the first few months until they decided that their political ideas weren't quite the same. So Blair eventually went and got an office with Gordon Brown. And then in 1987, Pat Wall was elected MP. He was also a militant member. And we find out in both Christopher Andrews' book and Peter Taylor's documentary that in 1983, the Labour Party had obviously suffered its worst election defeat for 65 years. But the idea that they were devoted to militant rather than the Labour Party was considered by the security services as their information that they were collecting suggested that after the 1983 election, Nellis and Fields actually went to Militant HQ and they were provided with what was described as a rapturous reception. And Peter Taylor's documentary tells us that there was an informant within Nellis' Coventry Labour Party who would then report back on Nellis. And Peter Taylor asked one of those involved with the surveillance on Nellis why he was, or how he could justify investigating a sitting MP. And the response was that he wasn't investigating an MP, he was investigating Militant, and Militant happened to have an MP. So by that way, he was investigating an MP, but was not the intention, was what was said. And then the threat from Militant was actually the fairly newly released files, which suggests that the threat wasn't limited at that. There was real concerns about militant members working within the civil service. And as I said earlier, in 1948, communists had been banned from working certain jobs within the civil service with access to secret information. There was a concern that they would steal the information, potentially pass it on to Russia, pass it on to Moscow. But at the time, Trotskyists weren't considered enough of a threat to cause concern to the authorities, so they weren't included on any vetting forms, and like that, they wouldn't be asked to admit to being a member of a Trotskyist organisation. By the 80s and the rise of Militant, things have begun to change, and we can see that by 1984, there was a strike at the Department of Health and Social Security offices in Newcastle. And it was believed that militant members were organising the strike and they didn't wish to, the suggestions in the files stated that militant members involved in the strike didn't want to agree to a settlement and instead hoped for the strike to run indefinitely because of the disruption it would cause to government services. Now, as says on the slide there, Sir Robert Armstrong, who was Cabinet Secretary at the time, said that this was real concern because it was a new and disturbing form of subversion. The threat was no longer to secretive information, it was instead to potentially grind to a halt the mechanics of local government, of different government departments and things like that. And the real concern was the fact that with the communists, they could always be taken away from a particular area of work which involved looking at secret information, whereas Trotskyist militant members, there was a concern that such a simple way of dealing with it didn't exist. They were really concerned that what would happen, but they also were very concerned what would happen if they took action, because they in the files it makes clear that they were very sure they couldn't take action in terms of just removing people because they were members of Militant. They understood that wasn't possible. So as the slide shows there, you might or might not be able to see it. It mentions the fact that this threat was, it's stated that Militant members were active and adept at exploiting real or imagined grievances amongst civil service staff, and their activity during disputes that allowed militant to increase its membership among civil servants. It's quite interesting that in some of these files, the permanent secretary at the Department of Health and Social Security, who was Ken Stowe, actually mentioned that the reason militant members had been able to gain a lot of support within civil service unions was actually a direct result of, or an indirect result of, the policies of the Thatcher government. So he wrote that the threat militant members now posed could be said to be an indirect result of government ministers losing the loyalty and commitment of the moderate centre in the civil service unionism through the policies they had pursued towards the civil service since 1979. So this concern, they knew that they couldn't remove militant members, but that they really thought that it was necessary to take some sort of action. So Robert Armstrong commissioned a report to investigate how extensive the problem was within the civil service, and the report that was produced stated that there were 1,420 people with subversive records working within the civil service in the mid-1980s. 733 of those were Trotskyists, 284 were members of Militant, but the report made clear that it probably understated the real figures, that Militant members, by their secrecy, wouldn't admit to it, or the security service wasn't clear on all the Militant members, so they thought that the threat would be greater. 1986, a Militant member, John Macready, was elected General Secretary of one of the main civil service unions, but he was actually unable to take up his post due to allegations of ballot irregularities. But in 1987, he was elected General Secretary of the same union. The procedures that were introduced following Robert Armstrong's report were government departments were required to work with the security service to maintain an up-to-date list of subversives working within the civil service, so they could collect information regularly. And it was departments were informed to ensure that subversives are not posted to work in key areas, and that persistent troublemakers, whether members of subversive organisations or not, are identified and removed from work in key areas. And the files actually show that in December 1985, when signing off the policy, Mrs. Thatcher wrote that civil service management should be very ready to sack subversive troublemakers if they are showed any cause under civil service rules. Now, the files don't go any further than that, so we can't be sure what happened, but I'd suggest that looking at examples in the past, I'd say at the very least that militant members were likely moved to certain jobs, and then the rest is only speculation. And that was the mid-80s, but by 1986, 1987, the threat had begun to dissipate. We see that we see that the disciplinary action that the Labour Party had begun to take made intelligence officials much more comfortable with the fact that Trotskyists were not able to threaten again. So by 1987, Militant was struggling, it was having serious setbacks in Liverpool, and Whitehall officials wrote that Militant had no immediate springboard for disruptive activity, and it was suggested that whilst it was necessary to keep an eye on their activities so that if anything happened in the future, they would know about it, it was considered that they could now take a back seat in investigating it. The threat had gone away near enough. Labour Party was taking action. There was no possibility of Trotskyists entering the Labour Party and gaining powers that way again. So what I'd say is, just as a few concluding remarks, that by the 1980s, Militant's threat, by looking at the files, was considerable, or it was considerable for authorities, intelligence authorities and civil service. And I think this is really interesting because it was the first and only time in which a Trotskyist organisation was considered to be a particular threat to the British state. And I think that the real reason for militant successes were the fact that the Labour Party disciplinary procedures had become more lenient, and this has allowed militant members to gain a power base, which Trotskyists had never managed to do before. And then the second reason I'd say is a lot of the other Trotskyist groups really struggled to keep their membership. They really struggled to have a unity and things like that. But with Militant, that unity was there. They weren't worried about internal disputes. They could focus on what they wanted to externally, and that enabled the organisation to really gain success. So we've got those two things there. So just as a final remark, I'd say that we can really see that we knew that Militant's successes in Liverpool and things like that had enabled Trotskyists to gain a degree of prominence. But during my research, I've found that Militant's activities provided the intelligence authorities with a reason to investigate, or believing they had a reason to investigate Trotskyist movement for the first time, and the threat was significant enough. So that's it.
Thanks, Oliver. I am going to open it up to questions, and we will probably try and plug in the external mic at this point.
Now, hopefully, if you want to ask a question here, it will be audible and also so will maybe ask. Here, do you want to do that? We'll test it. Folks, you can wave at me on Zoom if you can hear okay.
Yes, lots of questions, very interesting. I wondered, I mean, the context in which Militant rose was also about politics that was going on, you know, mass left-wing movements in Britain and industrial movements. I've got lots of questions, but one of the questions is that you've investigated surveillance.
Yeah.
Have you investigated other sorts of secret service activities, like giving advice to the Labour Party about how to defeat Militant, or, you know, dirty tricks?
I have, just before you answer, can I just say, did you hear that question? People on Zoom? No, okay. Right, so what we're going to have to do is, if you could summarise the answer, probably if you can't come back here, summarise the question. Yes, thank you very much. Thanks, very good.
Okay, then that question was broadly asked me if I focused on the surveillance of Militant from the security services, but have I investigated the intelligence community working with the Labour Party to try and deal with it? So what I have and I haven't. So I haven't done it in too much depth, but there are certain files, there are certain articles that I've read in different journals in the past, which suggest that in the 60s, so slightly before the period of Militant, the Labour Party had worked quite closely with the Information Research Department, which was an offshoot of the Foreign Office, which was an anti-communist propaganda organisation primarily, but they'd worked together in investigating the left of the Labour Party. And in the 60s, we see that the IRD was providing the Labour Party with certain information. What I would say is they worked quite a lot with the Labour Party headquarters rather than the politicians. So because of the fact that the NEC had moved significantly to the left by the 70s, I don't know, but it's possible both ways. It's possible that they did. It's possible that they didn't. I'm not sure. Is the answer? Okay.
Okay, so Pete Strong, you have your hand up there. Do you want to unmute?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you, Oliver. I mean, that was fascinating. Not least of all, because I was a supporter of a militant, as the the jargon had it way back in the early to mid 70s. I don't know if you can see it. I've actually still got my badge. You probably can't see it. Oh, there it is. No, there it is. Still got my badge. It says nationalised, don't subsidise, something like that. Yeah, I mean, I could talk myself about my own experience a lot, but just asking a couple of questions. First of all, this is recent history, so can you comment on what problems things like the 100-year rule and even the not so much the 30-year rule, but the 100-year rule might give you as a researcher, yeah. But also, it's quite well established, I think, that sometimes, perhaps often, the special branch and security services overestimate threats as a way of justifying their own existence. From my personal experience, I don't think we were ever anywhere near the level of threat that some of those documents suggest. So would you like to comment on that?
Okay, so just to take that first, what I'd say is, I don't think, looking historically, it's possible to judge in terms of, because there's that distance with history. So it's possible because one of the organisations that I was investigating was the Communist Party, obviously. And it's quite interesting that external people coming into the security service by the 1970s are actually questioning themselves why they are looking in such granular detail at organisations such as the Communist Party, but they actually say, when they're coming in the 1970s, we think we should be looking at the Trotskyist movement. Now, I don't think I can judge what the threat was in terms of, you cannot see the intelligence, obviously. But what I think is quite interesting in that is that there's, in one of Christopher Andrews' books, one of the quotes that he uses is, the best operations of the intelligence authorities come from things that we do not know, obviously. So it's difficult to make a judgment on that. From the first part of your question, I'd say the difficulty of looking at the files and things like that. We have, firstly, the 100-year rule, 30-year rule, things like that. The security services themselves are not under any obligation to provide any information. They do release quite a lot of things, but it tends to be, at the moment, the late 50s, early 60s is about as far as it goes. But it's quite interesting that in relatively recently released files that are in certain different department files, so the Cabinet Office, the Prime Minister's Office, the Foreign Office, the Home Office, they do include certain reports. So some of my research there that's allowed me to talk about that today actually comes as part of reports that are provided in those sort of files. And those files have been checked before, they've been weeded. So as you're looking through the files, there are certain things where it's been redacted, but then some files are left in. So it's possible to gain some knowledge without gaining the full picture. And I think it's really important to recognise that I'm making a judgment based on limited amounts of material, so you don't get the full picture, which kind of links to your second part, that I don't think the judgment is possible without seeing the whole picture. I hope that's answered the question for you.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think that's probably right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Duncan, you've got your hand up. Do you want to unmute? Duncan, can you hear me? Yeah. Do you want to unmute yourself, ask a question? Thank you.
Hello, yes, my name's Duncanbaudler from Cromsall. And like Pete, I was also a supporter of militants in the late 70s to early 80s, to about 85, when the miners' strike actually ended. That's when I left. And I think that one of the things that didn't come across in your speech, though I didn't get the first bit of it, sorry, was that my impression of it at the time of being in it was that it was actually a very working class organisation in a way that parts of the Labour Party weren't actually. And also it was quite dedicated in the way it went about things, in what it did. But the people in it were just ordinary people. There wasn't anything particularly different about them in my own view, except that they thought that they were revolutionary socialists, but they were just ordinary trade unionists, ordinary Labour Party members in a way who decided to join Militant as well. I was never aware of surveillance within Militant. I was never aware of anybody who I thought was a spy or anything like that. But one thing that did come across later on, about 86, 87, a friend of mine who was in Militant, who left about the same time as I did actually, was an electrician. And he went to work as a contractor, electrical contractor at Windscale, the nuclear power plant in Cumbria. And he went there for a week, and the next week he got sent home by his employer because the management at the plant had blacklisted him in some way. That's the only way he could describe it, because he hadn't done anything. So there must have been some way, some central way of collecting information on people, trade union activists or people who they thought were militant, and then blacklisting them.
That's interesting, actually. Just from what I said towards the end of the talk, that it seems that that was the case, that departments were informed to keep a record of people that were members of Trotskyist organisations, subversive organisations. So it's quite interesting to hear from that point of view. Thanks.
Frank, you've got your hand up. Do you want to unmute?
Yeah, Duncan, who's a friend and neighbour, live around the corner, reminded me that it was one of the most working class organisations I can remember. I mean, when I'm from Manchester, I went to Derby to work for British Rail in '86, and the Labour Party there had the divisions that were in Labour Party nationally, but everybody got on. The hard right would be personal friends with the hard left, you know what I mean? And we had these two working class lads, Chris and Ian, who came to our ward. And you could see there'd been some of these meetings that you described, but you would never have known where they were. It wasn't like a momentum meeting, it wasn't what you could just turn up to. And then they would produce these motions. And they really weren't from a middle class enough background to feel comfortable with a motion. So it would be taken into the ward, and the ward would look at it and would change it, sometimes to the point where it probably wasn't what the people who put them up to it really wanted. And they'd agree to everything. And they just sort of fitted in. One of them, Ian, was the actual auditor of the ward. Chris was the ward auditor, and I was the treasurer for a while. And he'd put you through your paces. I'd have to go once a year to his flat with all the receipts and everything to see what I'd done before he'd sign off my audit and things like that, which the others thought was beyond ridiculousness. But nonetheless, he did that. So, but it was, and some of the things they said were quite sensitive. Like they come out, one of the slogans was, "Young people want jobs and not courses," and that was one that really struck with me, because you could see that the answer, and sadly the answer from the Labour parties, people have employment difficulties. Oh, they must need a course. Whereas they actually must need a job. So I think there was a degree of subtlety to it that perhaps was more threatening than the actual organisation.
Yeah, I think in terms of the threat, or the perception of the threat anyway, having looked at especially the Communist Party and different organisations before, I think fundamentally it simply comes down to the fact that Militant referred to itself as a revolutionary organisation, talked about revolution, and those words in themselves were sort of a trigger for investigation, if you like.
Thanks, thank you, Frank. We've got an interesting lot of stuff in the chat, which I will forward on to Oliver. Kevin's pointed out organisations like the Economic League keeping blacklists. Yeah. So, Leah, do you want to unmute yourself? You have your hand raised.
Thank you. I'm another one who was active in Militant in my past. Yeah, obviously information. And I would say one of the things when Militant controlled the Labour Party Young Socialists, which was, I'm old enough, that was about when I got involved, there was masses and masses and masses of political education. Now, admittedly, from a particular perspective, but you were encouraged to do a lot of your own reading and even to speak at other Labour Party Young Socialists or your own Labour Party Young Socialists on a subject you're interested in. And I guess my point, which maybe isn't a point for you as a researcher, but is what are the lessons from this? So it seems to me that the institution of the state and those who support them, like the current Labour Party, and most of the Labour Party in history, have learned the lessons. So, for example, the current Labour Party disciplinary processes have now become ludicrously tight. People are self-silencing, etc. Just for information, I got kicked out, was a delegate, and I literally got kicked out mid-conference. I'm co-chair of Jewish Voice for Labour. That was anyway another story. But it's sort of, how do we learn the lessons? Those of us on the left, as I say, this may not be a question for you, but you often think with research, it's fascinating, and how do we use it in the current situation? So that's really my question. I was a full-timer for a year. There's an admission.
Yeah,
only admin.
I'm not sure I can add too much to that, as you're saying. It's not quite my area, but thanks for your comments anyway.
If you want to come a bit nearer come here so that people can hear you on the. Okay, yeah, you're out there. Shout.
Yes.
Okay.
Go ahead.
My question really is, what about the relationship between the security services and local police intelligence? Because my experience, let's say, of the late 70s and early 80s, was that there was loads of surveillance if you were involved in anti-racist activity, particularly with black organisations. If you were in the women's movement, I've got, evidence in my own experience about how we were, information was going to the local police. And also, and I wondered most crucially, in industrial disputes. I mean, look at the history of somebody like Alan Thornett in the Cowling Works in Oxford, the history of his and the machinations to get rid of him.
Yeah.
Had the stamp of security services.
Really?
Yeah.
To start with local police, as far as I know, like I was saying earlier, Peter Taylor's documentary tends to focus on this quite a bit, that they were sort of the foot soldiers, so they would be the ones who go and collect the information. So the relationship is quite close there, I think. And then in terms of your other points about which sort of organisations, it might be interesting for you to look at the undercover policing inquiry if you just look that up, because they have started to release some of the files, and it's only in its infancy really, but on their website they publish quite a lot of things, and it is quite a few of those groups that you're mentioning there, that there are certain bits, so there's definitely things about that. So if you looked at that, and then industrial disputes, similar sort of thing. There is some involvement there, I think. It might be more like one of the commenters mentioned, not sure who it was, sorry, economically, organisations like that might be more involved with that potentially, but yeah, very possibly.
And Kerry has flagged up for us undercoverresearch.net and the Twitter handle @undercovernet, a good account to follow about the Spy Cops inquiry. So Helen asks, she says she remembers the large militant group at Sussex University in the 1960s, which included Alan Woods. And her question is whether, Oliver, you used any other research methods, e.g. oral history interviews, as well as documentary sources in your research.
My research has tended to be focused on files from the National Archives, and I've just published, actually, co-authored with my supervisor, my PhD supervisor, an article in the Journal of Contemporary British History on exactly this topic. So if you had a look at that, you can see the sources there. So the majority of sources, like I was saying earlier, tended to be things such as Cabinet Office files, Home Office files, things like that you see reports, and you wouldn't expect it to be as much as it is, but they do produce lots of interesting little reports, and then you can read between the lines with certain things. So yeah, my research tends to have focused on National Archives files and more information like that. Christopher Andrews' books I mentioned, Peter Taylor's documentary. So those, I'd say, are the primary sources.
Thank you. Have we got questions here? Any questions coming from the audience here? Anybody else want to wave at me from the Zoom? I'm trying with my giant thumb there, sorry, to see if there's anybody else. We've got various things in the chats. I say, oh, all right, hang on, we've got a couple. Right, Declan, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just thinking, given the time, the 70s and the early 80s, I would have thought that well, I know that the focus of the Irish state would be very much the threat that was posed by by Irish republicanism and its fellow travellers in Britain. And there was a lot of infiltration. For example, you probably know that the national organisers, the Troops Out movement at one stage in the 1970s was their policemen who had access to the whole database of all the members, many of whom would have been on the British left. He later tried to infiltrate Big Flame, who actually caught him out and found out he was a police officer. And I imagine there was a lot of that going on. But I've always thought that, how do you put it, almost like job protection for the British police. You know, they'd have to justify their existence by proving that they were infiltrating these dangerous organisations. And I also thought the other primary concern, probably given Thatcher's comments, would have been the industrial action taken by the mine workers and such. So have you come across any evidence of infiltration in the trade unions and on solidarity organisations?
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the trade unions. Christopher Andrews' authorised history of the security service does mention significant amounts on that, actually. Beginning in the 1970s, the strikes under Ted Heath, a couple of minor strikes there, and then in the 1980s, obviously the 1984 minor strike. One of the really interesting things from that is it tended to be the government rather than the security services who saw the threat as significant then. We actually see in the 70s that Heath was regarding all industrial disputes as being subversive. The security services actually wrote a number of reports. Christopher Andrews quotes a number of them in his book, where they had told Heath that no, they weren't subversive and they weren't going to investigate them. And similar in the 80s, there was a degree of involvement during the miners' strike in the 80s, but again, the Thatcher government wanted more and more and more, while the security service actually said that they couldn't, by their charter, if you like, they couldn't go as far as that. So yes, there was investigations of industrial disputes, but the interesting point is that it was governments who were pursuing it more than intelligence services.
Peter, you wanted to come in on that, or ask something different?
Sorry, is that me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Slightly different. A little anecdote to give a sort of slightly different dimension on it. The memory suddenly come back to me. I was in the Bristol branch, but we also organised on sort of southwest region basis, and we had one supporter based in Plymouth who was actually a member of the Royal Navy, and that was all dealt with from our end under conditions of intense secrecy. We most of us never even knew his name. We knew him as Comrade E. In the end, he got busted. His locker was raided, and it was found to contain, well, nothing illegal, but what was considered to be incriminating. I was told he was booted out of the Navy, but I don't know if that was actually true. But just a little anecdote there.
That's interesting. Thanks.
Yeah.
Chris, you've had your hand up for a bit. Thank you.
I almost took it down because Declan's question was exceptionally very much the same as what I was going to ask, which is much more to do with the general situation, because there seemed to be a sort of an implication in the tour somehow or other of secrecy and being in the Labour Party being for some reason more significant than the rise of industrial action, other movements, I think particularly of the SWP and the Anti-Nazi League in the late 70s, again, an organisation which would overtly say it was revolutionary Marxist. I was in the IMG, another organisation that overtly said it was revolutionary Marxist. And the Militant newspaper didn't hold back in describing itself. So it seems kind of odd in a way that it should be particularly different, apart from my sort of observations around the Labour Party and secret takeover, maybe getting people more wound up in the establishment.
Yeah, like I said towards the end of the talk, for me anyway, the two crucial parts of militant, why it was considered a threat, is one, it's sort of its numbers and its unified membership, which compared to other Trotskyist groups, it was considered a lot more unified, which enabled it to sort of focus its attention on the outside rather than internal disputes. And then the other part is, as you say, the fact that discipline had enabled it to really gain a foothold within the Labour Party. So the two combined are, as far as I can see from what I've read and I've looked at, it's the combination of the two that led to the perception of the threat, really. Thanks.
Okay, folks, I think we may be drawing to a close unless anybody wants to wave a final wave at me. No. Okay, thank you so much, Oliver. Oliver has come up from Wolverhampton, and he has an audience here, but an audience remotely as well, a lot of whom obviously have a real interest in the history.
Yeah,
they've lived through what you've said.
Please do, if you can, go and have a look at Contemporary British History, the Journal of Contemporary British History, and if you're interested in the topic, I've written a longer article there. So,
thanks. Okay, so next week, folks, we have a half-term break in this series of talks, but we hope that you can join us, and it's going to be online only. The talk a week after next, so Wednesday the 17th of November at 2 p.m, Corinne Painter will speak on Hidden Histories, Revolutionary Women in Munich, 1919. Thanks very much again to Oliver and to all of our contributors here today. Best wishes in solidarity from all at the Working Class Movement Library. Goodbye.